Enough time has passed. People still talk about it in hushed tones, but it is time to answer the oldest question in the world regarding Daima. Is it canon? At first it may seem and feel trivial. Masako, of course it is. It's a whole new series. What would be the purpose of a new show if it didn't relate to all of the canon? What about all that juicy lore? Well, we shall get to that. The weird thing about Dragon Ball though is, as of recently, while we've gotten a lot of new media, all things considered, none of them feel like sequels, really. Every single one of them. The last two Z movies, Super and its movies, and manga, and finally, Daima. They were put in the most awkward position that a piece of media could be placed, namely, an interquel. Now, you may of course argue that Dragon Ball Super Broly has some larger prequel-like portions, but at the end of the day, the modern day portion happens before Goku leaves with Oob, the point which is considered to be the latest event in the canon timeline. And the introduction serves as a setup to what would be happening later, so in our mind it honestly doesn't count. Daima has a very clear beginning, age 775, which is 1 year after the Buu Saga. We know that precisely due to Trunks' birthday party, and this is when the first problem starts, as we no longer have Kibito Kai. And the story of Kibito Kai's diffusion is a complicated one. Initially, they just diffused, when old Kai ordered them to gather Namekian Dragon Balls, being worried that Champa was gathering them. When it turned out that he wasn't interested in all that, the elder of the two Glind ordered his descendant to return them. But before it actually occurred, this returning of balls, Kibito Kai asked Porunga to defuse them, angering the elder Kai. The anime version occurred after Golden Frieza's defeat, and before even Champa came into the picture. Finally, we have the Daima version, in which Buu was asked to eat the two, as thanks to the properties of his body, he could negate the effects of Potara, the whole bad air chestnut. And oh yeah, there's the GT version, when the split never occurred. The creators behind Dragon Ball are changing that so often that it almost feels intentional, like a running gag. Now, you could even go for a headcanon that when a Supreme Kai splits, it creates a new timeline, but I wouldn't take that really seriously. But still, Kibito Kai became our main indicator that something feels a little off, different. The next important bit of information comes soon after, when we learn that the Namekians originally came from the demon realm. Now, this tidbit had been teased for so long, especially during the Granola Saga, quite some time as well. First, we were shown in that Tournament of Power that our favourite green people are native not only to Universe 7, but also Universe 6. Then we have a direct confirmation from Elder Mori that they are told to have been originated from a different realm altogether. And this does seem to hold water with what we learned in Super. This feels like a proper supplemental addition, and it really doesn't seem to contradict anything. We also have some smaller things as the story unfolds, like Maba from Daima creating Majin Buu for Bibidi, considering that Babidi is not the most reliable narrator. This isn't a retcon to what we've been told in the show or in the manga, but rather going back on what Toriyama had stated earlier on in the Daizenshu guidebooks, which honestly seem to be considered secondary lore. Nice to have, but not gospel. If you don't see it in the media, it doesn't exist yet, and is subject to change. This is how, in our opinion, the guidebook lore should be treated. Now, the Glind lore is a little bit more complex, as it combines certain elements of the guidebooks with completely new statements, namely giving them a new name and ditching the fruity part of their tree-bound origin that we all come to know here on this channel. Instead of golden and red fruit, we have literal babies growing out of the trunk of a tree. Oh, and they're also an endangered species, a plot point which wasn't really explored or resolved in Daima, so I'm actually really sad about that. Also, there's one more thing that we haven't really seen being mentioned in the story, or the fandom actually. The status of the regular Kais. You know, the compass Kais, like King Kai and his other directional friends. In the old guidebook lore, it was assumed that they were born from the regular red fruits of the tree, core people. But right now, well, we don't really see any Glind of their type in the series, so are they still considered to be part of the same species, or are they something else entirely now? Also, the whole ancestor thing with Elder Kai and Shin, it also doesn't work anymore, because They would be distant siblings or cousins coming from a different tree. Still, it is possible that it is merely an honorary title. But on the other hand, we do see some familiar faces in the form of Supreme Kais from other universes, namely Goasu. Also, despite what you might think, Daima doesn't establish Shin as the OG Supreme Kai of Universe 7 and merely shows him together with the others to establish a direct connection for us. It's later stated that Nahare was part of the final exodus of his people, so there is no continuity hiccup over there. Also, there is Rimus, who clearly has some connection to Zeno, but it's kept mysterious for now. We made a whole video on it a while back, so make sure to check that out in the pinned comment or up top. And for the most part of the series, it would have seemed that this would be all weird stuff, messing with the continuity, until we got the star of the show in episode 18, Super Saiyan 4. But the biggest bombshell comes to us in the final installment of the series, when Vegeta points out that Goku had been hiding this form from his rival, and in fact had been cooking it in the background for quite a while now. Not only did it change our initial reaction to its appearance, we thought that Neva was the one who enabled its usage through magic and unlocking Goku's genetic potential. That would have been really cool and made some lick of sense. But it also opened the biggest can of worms for today's topic and arguably divided the fandom. Namely, if Daima is canon, why hasn't Goku even attempted to use Super Saiyan 4 against Beerus? You can make a lot of arguments like, oh, when he realized that Super Saiyan 3 wasn't even scratching the Destroyer, he knew that it would be pointless to go into 4. But we don't honestly really buy it, haven't I? He would at least try, especially when he learned how powerful Beerus actually was. And quite honestly, he was an opponent that Goku had treated seriously right from the start. He was told to by King Kai. It would also be weird for Vegeta not to pursue this transformation himself, considering that it would perfectly scratch his Saiyan itch, and in the GT timeline, he seemed to be really into Super Saiyan 4, to the point of working with Bulma to achieve it in a different way, the Blutz canon, through Blutz waves, like the S cells of GT. So as cool as it was, if we are meant to look at Daima as the prequel to Super, it kind of falls apart when you really look into it. And I think most of you knew that before clicking on this video. Now, keep in mind that different media of Dragon Ball have always shown different versions of events. The OG manga and anime are the easiest examples to divulge into, as a lot of filler was needed to allow for the production time necessary for both to function and operate at the same time. Also, most of the movies are kinda hard to fit in the timeline, save for maybe movie 9 and 13, and the status was always kinda wonky there. Not to mention there are certain purist behaviours in us, the fandom. A lot of us like to cut off GT entirely due to the minimal involvement of Toriyama, but we do see it as more canon than, let's say, Heroes or the Xenoverse games. Even though things get complicated with Kakarot, where apparently the author provided a lot more insight into proceedings, and then there's the thing with online, as we see a lot of ideas that were conceptualized back in the 2000s in the game, taking shape in the post-Z era of the franchise. So what even is canon anymore? Have you ever stopped to think about it, really? Let's look at the two uses of the word that are the most vital for the context in which we are using said word. Once again, with the help of Wiktionary. I'll just show you right here so you get the basic gist of it so you can pause. The two meanings that we have presented here are the original meaning of the word canon, as well as the one that we care about, the one every fandom gets crazy about. And honestly, we got a bit crazy too. After all, the need for continuous tissue and sequence of events is the most basic value we tend to attribute to the works of fiction. Dragon Ball has never been a procedural story. It clearly had events that occurred after earlier ones. There were callbacks and setups, even with the loosey-goosey style Toriyama had. But then again, there were some hiccups right from the very beginning. Some lessons being forgotten way too early, and a lot of it can be attributed to how the Dragon World works as a, well, world. It's playful, and has always been more about atmosphere and setting, being in the moment than the monumental, meticulously planned sagas, even if a lot of us wanted to see it that way. As we have mentioned in the past on multiple occasions, it does seem that it is our Western obsession to care that much for canon, at least in such a strict and rigid sense. The longer I look back at Dragon Ball, the closer it seems to legends and folk stories. Those often have similar elements, but different versions and retellings differ, depending on who is telling the story, or to whom. It doesn't invalidate the other variants, but merely enriches the world of cultural context that exists around those stories. At the end of the day, if you love a certain movie or GT, does it really matter if it's part of the same continuity as Z or Super? Does not being in there make them a lesser thing? Is it even the criterion which we should value various parts of Dragon Ball? Because honestly, if we look at canon in this narrow, continuity-driven sense, very little stuff remains. A lot of the filler is still beloved. Many events are better in the manga than in the anime and vice versa, but they did happen. All of it. Look for a second on the original meaning of canon, the one connected to the laws and principles. Remember what we were saying in our reviews of Dragon Ball Daima? It replicated a lot of the stuff that made a lot of Dragon Ball truly great. It also repeated some of the same mistakes, which arguably makes it fulfill this criteria of being canon. It's not alienating or devoid of the presence of the things which we recognize as being part of Dragon Ball. In a way, the way it ended had been one of the more Dragon Ball-like things that Dragon Ball had ever seen, really. Also, for those of you still bothered about the continuity, I am quite sure that all the role reveals, the ones about Rhymus, the Namekians, the Glint, and other demons, they are meant to be relatable to other timelines. So in fact, it is treated as canon. Maybe the exact events of Goku's adventure aren't, but the background and new knowledge that we've got surely will be. So is Daima canon? Yes and no. It really depends on why you choose it to be so, as canon itself is a really flimsy word, with it like having 13 different meanings. And as we get older, haven't I? Us approaching 40, we start to see this meaning less to us, at least the continuity aspects. They become less and less meaningful. And while it's nice to see stuff connect, we do realize that valuing something based on this aspect, it can be a little bit reductive. And maybe we wasted loads of years bothering about it way too much upon reflection. Oh, we wasted our life. But after all, if Toriyama and his Japanese audience didn't really bother about canon, why should we? Because ultimately, there is something poetic about everything Dragon Ball related and it being canon. Well, I mean, almost everything. Not you, episode of Bardock. You were truly awful.